For this section, I'm going to work with my markers as watercolors. I'm going to show you a couple different ways of doing that. So I have here just a styrofoam takeout box, and I've used a fairly new markers to add pigment onto here that I can draw from to use like paint. And then I also have next to me another empty, the other side of the takeout thing that I can use for mixing. It's important that you do this on, like, you can't do it on paper. It won't work as well. You can't create like little paint palette from paper. But I'm also going to show you another way as well to use your markers on here as watercolors. I'll start out with my little paint palette, and I've just got my brush that I'm working with, and you don't want too much water here. You really only need a little bit, but I can pull from this. I can draw paint. I can use it just as is on here, but then I can also move some of this pigment over here. Maybe I even want to start with just some blue pigment on here, the colors that I want to mix. I think that might be easier. Like if I want to create a shade, maybe I'm just going to color a little bit of those two colors directly on here. And again, dry my brush off a little bit. I don't want it to be too wet. But I can stir those two things together. I can see if I want to adjust. I'm going to add a little bit more black to it so that it gets a little darker, it turns into more of a shade, and then I can start painting with this. Now, one thing you will find as you're painting with this is you're going to end up with lighter colors because you're taking, marker pigment and pulling it around. You're not going to get as dark of colors as you would get when you're working with the cakes or the tubes. It's just, they'll be a little bit more muted, they'll be a little bit more tint based rather than like real saturated, vibrant colors. Okay, it's also wanting to dry into my paper more, so it might be good to paint some just water down first before trying to apply your pigment that you created from that marker onto your paper. So I'm just going to finish in this little section here. It behaves fairly close to watercolor on the paper. The principles are the same as far as it being a watercolor that you're working with. Stirred those two together. And just keeping working with this fairly, I said not to use much water. You don't want to use a whole lot of water on here, but I think you do need to use a little bit more water on your paper than you may with the other methods. All right, so I'm just going to finish painting in, again, all my negative space in this composition, okay? And I can use the blue straight as is. Oh, I do want to show you something with the black, and I'm going to show you another thing that you can do after I finish this section. So the other thing with these markers, if you're working with water-soluble, washable markers, you can, and it's a little tricky to do this in a way that looks really successful, so I'm going to give you a couple tips. You can color with the markers directly onto your project. If you want to get some more vibrant colors, you can use these markers and color straight on here and then paint that pigment around. Now, the way I would suggest doing that, if that's something you're interested in doing, is rather than just like coloring or scribbling in an area and then expecting that paint to travel around, would be to outline whatever area it is that you're working in. Okay, so I'm just adding a pretty bold outline of this blue around this section here, making sure that it goes all the way up and touches my outline. And once I have finished outlining this section and I'm happy with my outline, again, you want to make it a fairly bold outline so it gives a lot of pigment to pull from. So I'm even going to kind of double up this line with my marker and use my marker so it's laying on its side a little bit so that I get it as thick as possible. And then you can take your paintbrush and just water, just regular water, and you can start to draw from that pigment and pull into the middle. Now you'll notice it is not turning into a smooth transition from marker to where the marker is filling in. So that's why I say it's not as easy to make this look nice unless you're really willing to put careful outlining down. Now I think this could have a pretty cool effect, doing this outline in your negative spaces and then pulling this pigment in. You just have to really be willing to take the time to do that nice outline, and you have to like this look of this kind of bold outline, then shifting to the lighter fill-in area. It really does help to have washable markers to do this because they're going to be more water soluble. This particular marker is not a washable marker, so it is drawing it in some, but it's not drawing it in as much as a washable marker would. Now I could also come back and I can add some of my marker pigment that I created into this. If I want to try to transition that a little bit more smoothly, I can just add more pigment to my palette here, and I can use this along that edge of that outline, and that will give me a little bit smoother of a shift from that dark to the light. It's creating a really, in my opinion, interesting line along where the water is creeping into that marker outline that I think is pretty cool. It almost looks like, well, in like at the beach where the ocean is going out and sort of like the marshlands, the way the sand sort of splits apart and creates really cool texture. That's happening here, which is kind of cool. And then you can just finish filling in this area using a combination of that method and your palettes to get all of your negative space. All right, in this little section, I was not paying super close attention and I started painting in a leaf. So I started painting in positive space instead of negative space. Because I noticed it fairly quickly, I'm going to try to lift as much pigment as possible by just painting water straight on it, not scrubbing it, but just painting it on and using a paper towel to soak up as much as possible. Now I can still see that that's there, but it's much, much lighter than it was. So it's not, I'll be able to cover that up fine when I move to the next step. And with dabbing it off with the paper towel that much, I don't think it's gonna bleed too much as I paint this little area in that I was supposed to be painting in. All right, so I've finished with my negative space. Everything's fairly wet, so I'm gonna allow it to dry before I move into that positive space. So my marker has had time to dry and I'm ready to come back into my positive space. For working with markers, I've got the same palette set up now with my magenta and my yellow, and then I've got a new little mixing space that I went ahead and just added also some orange onto, and I'm gonna have orange available over in this palette as well. I'm gonna try as much as possible not to use the orange marker so much on its own so that I have to mix. But I want to have it available because it's harder to get variety in color when you're working like this. And then I've got the actual markers themselves available so that I can do the outlining technique if I want. This is important. I cleaned my water, okay? I'm starting with fresh water because this water was really blue from working with it with my monochromatic blues, and with orange and blue being complementary colors, it's going to muddy it up if I don't work with clean water. All right. So I'm just gonna come back. I'm actually, in my smaller spaces, gonna use my little bit smaller paintbrush, and I'm gonna work on mixing some colors here on my little mixing tray by just adding water to them. And then just like I would paint with regular watercolor paints, I can paint in my sections of my leaves. I just took my paintbrush and just stirred all the yellow that I had on this little mixing tray in. I'm gonna even add a little bit more to get a more yellow orange color for another section. And I can, just like I'm working with watercolor paints, start painting these sections in. Now I can also do the outlining thing here as well, where I take that time to fairly boldly outline my shapes. And you could just do it like this for the whole project if you wanted to. It's up, up to you. Or you can do a mix like I'm doing. And then with that clean, saturated brush, I'm just going to draw that yellow pigment into the center. Now yellow and white, of course, are fairly close in value. Yellow is the lightest color. So those are, it's harder to see that line the way you can see the line within the blue section. Here's another thing you could do. I'm going to outline this shape here with my yellow. Pretty bold outline. For this, I'll use my larger brush because this is a larger shape. So I'll switch over and use that larger brush to draw this pigment out. But then I have an idea of something that I think would work pretty well. All right, so I'm going to use that larger brush and start to draw this yellow pigment in. But while it's still wet, of course, yellow is one of my selected colors, so I could just leave it like this and that would be fine. But while it's still wet, I'm going to come grab some of this magenta and I'm going to add it in, okay? And I don't know that I'm going to add it in all over the whole leaf. I can come back in with some water and I can allow this section of this magenta, this nice orange that I created by adding that little bit of magenta, to bleed into other areas of my leaf. Maybe I want to do that over here just for balance, to kind of balance from one side of my leaf to the other. Okay, maybe in this leaf right here, maybe I want to go for that type idea again. I'll start with orange this time though, and I'm going to outline with orange, adding that bold outline to give a lot of color to work with, sticking right up against my edge. And I'm going to pull it in again, but before it's dry, and rather than stirring it around, I'm going to grab some of that magenta that I've got set up and ready and just put some little dots, the way like leaves in the fall sometimes end up with some places that are, I don't know, like little brown spots on them or something. So I'm just going to add some little red dots, and then I'm just going to leave that alone. I'm not going to paint over it. I'm just going to let it dry and see what kind of texture results from that. And I'm going to finish painting all of these areas in using my different techniques that I have available to me of mixing my colors ahead of time on my little tray, or using that marker outline. I am going to be mindful of which areas are wet. Like I don't want to paint this little section of this stick yet because this leaf is very wet. And if I try to paint that right now, all that's going to end up is those two areas are going to bleed together, and that's not going to be what I want. So I'm going to make sure I allow this to dry. I'm just going to kind of skip around, paying attention to what's wet and what's dry, and only paint areas that are dry. Now you might notice right here, this yellow really bled into the blue right there. The blue was dry, but it still for some reason wanted to bleed. That's okay. I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to worry about trying to fix that. That's a property of watercolor, that it bleeds, and that's fine. It's not a detriment to a project by any means to have some unintentional bleeding. It's just an issue where it's like if it happens kind of all over the whole thing because you don't pay attention to what's wet and what's dry. That's where it would create an issue. But like little bits like that happen are fine to have as a part of your project. So I'll finish painting this out and we'll see what it looks like. So I've finished painting this section in. There are some places really where it section to section bled together, sometimes positive into negative space. It's fairly minimal, and I think that's okay. There are some places that I may go back once it's totally dry and touch up. For example, like right here, this hole in this leaf, the yellow like really just bled all into that. So once it's totally dry, I can come back in with a little bit of blue and just touch that up. Places like this, I could fix it if I wanted to, but I think I don't know, I may leave it. But this would be how you can finish out the marker watercolor technique. The texture that resulted from this bleed that I allowed to happen, I think is really cool and might be just like a neat way to go at lots of sections of that.